Again, this lecture will not be as detailed as some of the upper body lectures, but that's because while we need to understand how the lower body works and what the movements are and have a general understanding of the muscles, it is not within our scope of practice to do formal assessment, formal range of motion, all of that for lower body. So if we're looking at it from a topographical view, these are the landmarks that you will see both from the anterior and the posterior view. Just to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be looking at, and if you're looking down at your leg, what you would be seeing. And then a quick review of what the movements of the leg are. So when you're looking at the knee joint that we covered last week, you're looking at flexion and extension. There's also a small amount of medial and lateral rotation at the knee when it is flexed. It's a very small movement, but there is a little bit of medial and lateral rotation there with the knee being flexed. And then when we get to the ankle, that's where we get a few more movements. So looking at the ankle, you're going to have dorsiflexion. So if you're pulling your toes up towards the ceiling, that would be dorsiflexion. And then if you're stepping on a gas pedal, that's plantar flexion. And then you have eversion and inversion. So if you're trying to rotate your foot medially so that your big toe is down towards the ground, that would be eversion. If you go the opposite direction so that your little toe is towards the ground, that would be inversion. So just a quick review of all of those movements for the knee and for the ankle. All right, so we will start off with the lower portion of the leg. This will be made up of two bones. You have your tibia and your fibula. I kind of like to compare this to the upper extremity because there are several similarities to it. The tibia I like to think of as being similar to the ulna as it runs superficially. This one runs from the knee to the ankle. And the fibula's relationship to the tibia is very similar to that of the radius's relationship to the ulna. So it's lateral, it's deeper, it has muscles surrounding it, and it doesn't have that full attachment at both knee and ankle joints to allow for more mobility. The fibula bears only about 10% of your body's weight. It is the thinnest bone in the body in proportion to its length. So it is a long, thin bone. And it has fewer actual attachments, similar to the radius. This image was one of the best I could find with clear landmarks when you're looking at the bones of the leg. And I did update the lab identification guide. I apologize, it was not updated on Monday, so that you know landmarks and what you should be looking for and being able to identify. Two of those landmarks will be the medial and lateral condyles. Those will be at the proximal end near the near your knee joint. That's where you're articulating there. Looking at the tibia, another landmark is that tibial tuberosity. And then knowing the general, this is the head of the bone, this is the shaft or the body of the bone. And then at the distal end, knowing the lateral and medial malleoluses. So those are a few landmarks for bones of the leg. All right. Next, I have a couple of short videos that are just going to review these bones and give you a skeletal view of them. And the first one we'll look at is the tibia.
All right, we are looking at the medial bone of your leg, so of the lower limb. The leg, you have paired bones, just like you do in terms of your upper limb or your forearm region. So whereas you have the radius and ulna here, you're going to have the tibia and the fibula, which is the lateral bone. The tibia, in comparison to the fibula, is considerably more robust. This is really the weight-bearing bone. Fibula has very little to do in terms of weight bearing. It's more of a muscle attachment site. So we're looking at an anterior view here, and one of the first things I want you to note, and the shaft or the body portion of the tibia, is this line right here. And you can actually palpate this on yourself. It's really fairly close in terms of the skin. So we considered this subcutaneous, and you can palpate the tibia the entire way down. All right, so let's look at a superior view of the tibia. And you can see you have these very shallow condyles. This is going to be your medial condyle and your lateral condyle. Now, how you know that this is medial if you have an entire tibia is that you'll have the medial malleolus or malleolus here. So, what's going to articulate here? We know we're talking superiorly. We're very shallow. This is going to be the inferior portion of your knee joint. So your femoral condyles will articulate here, and this will be a portion of your knee joint. So this whole region right here is referred to as the tibial plateau, and then you'll have the two condyles right here. Now, right in the middle of the condyles, you'll have what we refer to as your intercondylar eminence. This is where you're going to have attachment of your ACL and your PCL ligaments. So your anterior cruciate ligament, and then crisscrossing that, you'll have your posterior cruciate ligament. So typically, if you have some type of injury, it typically occurs at your ACL, and you might have a tear away from your intercondylar eminence. All right, so let me move this back more into anatomical position. So here's your superior and inferior portions, and you'll have this robust region right under the tibial plateau, referred to as the tibial tuberosity. And this is where that patellar ligament, or the most inferior portion of your quadriceps femoris tendon, attaches. So we know about right here is where your patella is going to be located, because the patella is a sesamoid bone that forms within this quadriceps femoris tendon. All right, let's flip the bone over. So anterior, now we're going posterior. And one thing I want you to note here is this building up in the superior portion of bone. This is what we refer to as your soleal line. And as the name would indicate, your soleus muscle, so very important in terms of plantar flexing or being able to stand on your toes, your soleus muscle is going to attach here. All right. Now we're moving to the inferior portion of the bone, and as you can see, you have a very shallow and smooth area. This is going to articulate with your superiormost tarsal bone, or your talus or talus bone. All right, so important in terms of forming your ankle joint. The last thing of note, so I flip back over to an anterior view, is your medial malleolus. All right, so if you were to feel your ankle, if you feel the medial portion of your ankle, this is what you're feeling, your medial malleolus. And then if you recall in the video for the fibula, you're going to have a lateral malleolus, so that's what you can feel on the lateral side. So if you're just looking at this bone, why don't we try to estimate if this is a right or a left? Okay, so we know this is medial. So this is going to have to be a left tibia, because this is going to be medial, and you'll have your medial condyle right here in the superior portion.
All right. And the really short little video for the fibula.
So the tibia, which is the medial of the lower limb bones, is considerably wider, more robust, and it's really the weight-bearing bone. whereas the fibula, which is what we're looking at now, is not a weight-bearing bone. Its main function is in terms of muscle attachment. And you can see, particularly on the shaft or the body of the fibula, all these lines where certain muscles attach, particularly those on the anterior leg. Now, one of the main questions I get asked about in terms of the fibula is which way's up and which way's down. And that's because the head and the distal end of the fibula are actually pretty similar in terms of appearance. So let's start with the more proximal portion, or the head. Now, I always describe it as a bit more robust, and in terms of its smooth articular surface, that's going to be facing up or superiorly. So you have a smaller facet in terms of articulation there. Now, right underneath it, you have the thinner neck, which is pretty typical in terms of any type of anatomical neck. It's generally a little bit thinner than the other areas. And then lastly, the most distal portion of the fibula is what's referred to as the lateral malleolus. Sometimes you'll hear malleolus. Both are correct. Now I want everyone to touch the side of their ankle and feel that big projection or that bump. This is what you're feeling. You're feeling this lateral malleolus. So you know that this has to be the most distal portion of the bone. And you're going to have a more substantial smooth area because this is articulating with the talus, forming one portion of the ankle joint.
Okay, so those were the two bones of the leg. And now we'll move on and look at muscles of the leg. So muscles of the lower leg can be divided into four groups. So you have your anterior compartment, which are going to be your extensors. You have your lateral compartment, which will be your fibularis longus and brevis. And then you have two different posterior compartments. You have a deep compartment and you have a superficial compartment. So the deep compartment will primarily be the flexors of the leg, and the superior compartment will be what's commonly referred to as your calf muscles. So your gastrocnemius and your soleus. And we're going to look at all of these in a little more detail. But I think it's helpful if you can divide them into those groups, especially when you don't need to know quite as much isolated muscle on these. So starting with that anterior compartment, it is going to be, these muscles are located between the shaft of the tibia and the fibularis muscles. And there are three muscles that are in this anterior compartment. The picture here shows them as a grouping. And that's what you would see if this was to be on a quiz or an exam. But the three muscles are your tibialis anterior, your extensor digitorum longus, and your extensor hallucis longus. So they all have a little bit different origin, insertion, and a little bit different action. Tibialis anterior originates on the lateral condyle of the tibia, and it's going to insert on that medial cuneiform in the base of your first metatarsal. That muscle is going to assist with inverting the foot and dorsiflexion of the ankle. The extensor digitorum longus originates on the lateral condyle of the tibia, and it's going to insert on the phalanges of your second through fifth toes. This muscle is working on extension of those toes, dorsiflexion of the ankle, as opposed to inverting. This one helps with that eversion of the foot. And then the extensor hallucis longus is going to originate mid-fibula. It's going to insert on the distal phalanx of the first toe, and it is responsible for extension of that first toe. And then it assists with dorsiflexion of the ankle and inversion of the foot. So the biggest takeaway for these is they all work on dorsiflexion of the ankle. Two of them help with inversion, one helps to evert, and then think about extension of the toes. Hallucis goes to the first toe, extensor digitorum goes to digits 2 through 5. Next, we're going to look at the superficial posterior muscles, the ones that are commonly referred to as your calf muscles. This is made of two muscles. It's your gastrocnemius, which is commonly called your gastroc, or your soleus muscle. The gastrocnemius originates on the condyle of the femur. It's going to insert on your calcaneus, and its action is knee flexion and plantar flexion at the ankle. And then your soleus, as that video showed earlier where that soleal line is, that's where this muscle will originate. It also inserts on the calcaneus, and it is responsible for assisting with plantar flexion of the ankle. So two different muscles, two different origins, but they come together and they both attach to that calcanean tendon. We'll talk more about this tendon in a little while, but this is the one that's commonly referred to as your Achilles tendon. Your gastroc muscle actually has two different heads, and so it crosses two joints. And as we've talked about, if it crosses two joints, it has two primary actions. So it has responsibility for movement at the knee and at the ankle. When doing some research for this class, when I was looking up the soleus muscle, one thing I learned that was interesting is this muscle is deep to the gastroc. So if you're looking at the slides, the muscle set on the left is the gastroc, and the one on the right that's deep to that is the soleus. But the soleus is sometimes called the second heart. This muscle plays a really important role in strong contractions that help return blood from the leg to the heart. So it has a really important action related to circulation that the other muscles in this region don't have. If we look deeper to that, you have three really slender muscles that are deep to the soleus, and these muscles are primarily responsible for inverting the foot and flexing the toes. These are commonly used if you think about walking on your tiptoes or hiking a rocky trail. That's when these muscles will come into play. This group is made out of the tibialis posterior, the flexor digitorum longus, and the flexor hallucis longus. The tibialis posterior originates on the proximal posterior shaft of the fibula and the tibia, and it's going to insert on your 5 tarsal bones and the 2 through 4 metatarsals. When you're thinking about digits, it will be your toes 2 through 4. This is a really weird angle that we're looking at for the picture. We are looking at the posterior side. Some of the bones are missing, but what you're seeing is that the tendons from these muscles are running as if they're running down and around or underneath your heel in that general area. I removed some of the skeletal so you could actually see where there's a running out to the toes. Tibialis posterior assists with inversion of the foot and plantar flexion of the ankle. And then flexor digitorum longus, it's going to originate on the middle posterior surface of the tibia and insert on the distal phalanges of toes 2 through 5. It will assist with flexion of those toes. Um, it does assist with plantar flexion, but that's a very weak movement. I would not consider that a primary action. And it also assists with inversion of the foot. And then the third of these muscles is the flexor hallucis longus. It's going to originate mid-fibula and insert on the distal phalanx of the first toe. This one is responsible for flexion of that first toe, inversion of the foot, and again, it has some mild assistance with plantar flexion, but it is a weaker movement. These weak movements are more, it's not their primary action, but if the primary muscle is damaged, it could be a secondary pathway to help that motion occur. So those are some deeper muscles. These are also considered deep posterior muscles, although I think of them more as the lateral muscles. This group is your fibularis longus and your fibularis brevis. So if you're looking at my images, the picture on the left-hand side is going to be longus, and the smaller highlighted muscle on the right is brevis. The longus is going to originate on the head and lateral aspect of the fibula, and it will insert on the base of the first metatarsal. And brevis is going to originate on the distal fibula, and it's going to insert on the tuberosity of the fifth metatarsal. So these have a shared action for eversion of the foot and assisting with plantar flexion of the ankle. These muscles are also considered lateral muscles. This is your plantaris and your popliteus. The plantaris originates on your lateral supracondylar line of the femur. It's going to insert on the calcaneus as well. It is a long, thin muscle with a really long tendon. The actions of it are both very weak. So again, I would consider this more of a secondary muscle when you're looking at plantar flexion of the ankle and assisting with flexion of the knee. It technically crosses both of those joints. And that would be the really long muscle that you see on the screen. And then you have your popliteus muscle. It is a smaller muscle on the, it's considered lateral, but I think of it being on the posterior side of your knee. It's going to originate on the lateral condyle of the femur and insert on the proximal posterior tibia. And this muscle assists with medial rotation of the knee and flexion of the knee. All right, so those are the primary muscles of the lower leg. I did want to talk briefly about one tendon that is a very common insertion site, and that is the calcaneus, which is also known as the Achilles tendon. I thought I'd give you a little bit of why it's called the Achilles tendon. Some of you may know, but it is based in Greek mythology. The myth was that the baby Achilles, who was a warrior, was dipped into a river by his mother to make him invulnerable. And he was completely immersed except for by the ankle where she was holding him. And this you'll read about when you read about the Trojan War, that after fighting the Trojan War, he was wounded when an arrow penetrated his heel. So this name refers to a really small but fatal weakness, because if you injure the calcaneus or your Achilles tendon. Think about all of those muscles that are inserting on that tendon. It really plays a major role in your mobility of your lower leg. So there's your Greek mythology lesson for tonight. There is a video to accompany the muscles of the leg, and we will watch that one now.
So we're talking about the lower limb muscles, particular to the leg, and these muscles are very different depending on if you're looking at the anterior portion or the posterior portion. So let's start with the anterior compartment of the leg. And before we get into the actual muscles, I want to talk about how these muscles are very tightly bound within the connective tissue here. So if you have any blood or fluid that's going to escape, it's not going to get very far. It's going to get trapped within the compartment. So if you've ever heard of the term compartment syndrome, typically they're talking about in the specific compartment. So there's three main muscles in this region. I'm not going to have you memorize the particular muscles, but I want you to understand at least the actions that can occur with contraction of these muscles. So importantly, you're going to have dorsiflexion of the ankle. So remember, dorsiflexion, those toes are going to be pointing up. Extension of the digits, so those tendons are going to allow for the digits. Remember, this would be flexion, extension's going to be coming out, so when you're just standing normally. And then inversion of the foot. So in particular, if you're looking here, here is your tibia. All of these anterior compartment muscles are going to be on the lateral side right here. And the largest one right here is your tibialis anterior. Any muscle that starts with tibialis is going to play a role in terms of inversion of the foot. All of these muscles are going to be efferently or motor innervated by the deep fibular nerve. And the deep fibular nerve is going to be a branch of your common fibular nerve. And the common fibular nerve is one of the terminal branches of your sciatic. So, say you do have some type of escape in terms of the fluids that can occur within this area. This can cause for your tibialis anterior to really be smashed down, so that can cause some issues there. Also, if you continuously use your tibialis anterior, this can allow for little micro tears within the muscle that can actually affect the periosteum of the tibia here. So if you've ever heard the term shin splints, it's typically having something to do with your tibialis anterior. Now on the lateral compartment of the leg, these are going to be composed of two muscles, your fibularis longus and brevis. And longus is going to be the more important of the two. And you can see right here, only in this view, you have your fibularis longus. The brevis is going to be deep to this muscle. So this is going to be innervated by the other branch of the common fibular, your superficial fibular nerve. And you can actually see right here in this image your common fibular, and that superficial, the split of the superficial and deep is going to be right underneath your fibularis longus muscle. So remember, the tibialis muscles are going to play a role in terms of inversion of the foot, so the fibularis muscles are going to be eversion of the foot, so allowing for the sole of the foot to move more laterally. Also, they're going to play a very, very weak role in terms of plantar flexion. All right, so let's move posteriorly now. And you have two compartments associated with the posterior side. You're going to have a superficial, which is what we're looking at here. And this is by far the more substantial and the more important of the two compartments. And you're going to have a deep, which we'll discuss in just a moment. So the superficial compartment is composed of two muscles, your gastrocnemius or gastrocnemius, you'll hear it either way, and your soleus muscle, which is going to be deep to the gastrocnemius. So you can see here, when you think of your calf muscles, these are the two muscles that you're thinking of. Gastrocnemius is going to be the more superficial, and soleus will be deep to these two muscles, or to this area. Now what's important is you're going to have these two muscles, they're going to kind of come together in terms of their distal attachment, and they're going to share one tendon, and that's your calcaneal tendon, and we've all heard of your calcaneal tendon referred to as your Achilles tendon. This is the strongest tendon in the body. If you have damage to your calcaneal tendon, that can really have devastating effects in terms of being able to plant or flex the foot, or even to simply be able to walk, because plantar flexion is going to play a role there. These muscles are going to be innervated by the tibial nerve, which is one of the terminal branches of the sciatic. Plantar flexion, this is hugely important here. So these are the main plantar flexors of the ankle. Also that gastrocnemius, if you can see here, and you can see a little bit, you can see that it's extending up past the knee joint region. So it can play a role in terms of flexion of the knee. Now if you were to reflect these muscles out of the way, then you would be looking at the deep posterior compartment of the leg. Similarly innervated by the tibial nerve, which you can actually see in this visual here. So it kind of sits on top and sends muscular branches to these. These are also going to play a role in terms of plantar flexion of the ankle. However, it is such a minor role that, say something did happen in terms of the calcaneal tendon, or in terms of just the gastrocnemius muscle or the soleus muscle, these could not compensate for that particular action. Certain muscles within this compartment will also play a role in terms of flexion of the digits, so think about curling your toes, as well as inversion of the foot, because you have in here your tibialis posterior muscle. So tibialis, you know, we're talking inversion of the foot. So these muscles, as you can see, they're going to extend into the foot, so the tendons are actually extending, so they can play a role in terms of the digits or in terms of the subtalar and transverse tarsal joints.
Okay, so we will move on to briefly talk about the ankle, and we will start with the ankle video.
So the most inferior of the synovial joints that we're going to discuss is the talocrural. So we know crural, we're getting into the ankle joint. So colloquially referred to as the ankle joint. And this is really a true hinge joint. You can see here that the distal ends of the tibia and the fibula, so those medial and lateral malleoli. So here's your medial malleolus and your lateral malleolus of the fibula over here. And then the main tarsal bone of the ankle joint is the talus, which you can see here. And as I said, this is a true hinge joint. So we have flexion and extension, but it's in this particular joint, we refer to this as dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So you can see dorsiflexion pointing your toes up, plantar flexion standing on your tiptoes. Let's look at it here. You can see you have a smaller range of motion with dorsiflexion as opposed to plantar flexion. But when you are plantar flexing, this is quite a bit less stable than dorsiflexion. Now there are two other joints in this region that I want you to be aware of, but we're not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail. This is the subtalar. All right, so the subtalar is going to be between the calcaneus, or your heel bone, and your talus. All right, so that's subtalar. And then the other one I want you to be aware of is the transverse tarsal joint, and this is going to be between the calcaneus and the talus together and the rest of your tarsal bones. All right, so these two joints are going to allow for this other movement that I want, or other suite of movements I want you to understand, which are going to be inversion and eversion. All right, so let's look here. Inversion, the sole of your foot is going to be pointing medially. Eversion, the sole of your foot is going to be facing laterally. Now the reason that I want to discuss these two movements with dorsiflexion and plantar flexion is that You very rarely can do these types of movements separately. So say if you are plantar flexing, you typically will have some degree of eversion or inversion, and vice versa. So these movements often occur together, even though the particular joints are different. All right, so the deltoid ligaments are going to be on the medial side, as you can see. This is referred to as the medial ligaments, and it's important to note that this is a suite of 4 ligaments. These are considerably stronger and more robust than what you're going to have on the lateral side. And one thing I want to note, and that what's going to be different than the lateral side, all these ligaments are going to have an attachment on this medial malleolus of the tibia. But importantly, these ligaments not only attach on the medial malleolus, but the fibers kind of intertwine to really have a more solid attachment there. So not only are attaching to the bone, but kind of intertwining with one another. Now these particular suite of ligaments is important in terms of stabilizing the joint during eversion. Okay, so let's remember eversion, the sole of your foot moving laterally, okay, so facing laterally. And if you think about how the range of motion for eversion as compared to inversion, that makes sense that these are going to be the stronger of the two. Now you can see here that it's a bit more hodgepodge on the lateral side of the ankle joint. So you have 3 separate ligaments here. They're all attaching on the lateral malleolus as well, but those fibers don't actually intertwine. So not quite as strong on this side. And this really plays a role in terms of stabilizing during inversion. So invert your foot. Remember the sole of your foot moving medially. You think you can do that quite a bit more than eversion. So if you think about kind of your foot getting stuck and you're inverting your foot too much, it'll cause these particular ligaments to be damaged. So this is when you think of an ankle sprain or injury to the ankle. Typically it's happening on this lateral side. This is the last of the synovial joints that we're going to discuss. We're going to move on to the actual skeletal muscle that's going to contract and allow for these joints to move.
So I wanted to include a picture of what was discussed in the video as far as where the ligaments are located. This is just so that you have an awareness of the ligaments, but not that you will be asked to identify them individually. The only real identification from this slide would be that Achilles tendon there. Similarly to the wrist, and you think about the retinacula there at the wrist, you also have retinacula at your ankle. And this picture is showing there's 2 different ones. So you have the superior extensor retinaculum, and then you have the inferior extensor retinaculum. This provides support for the tendons of the extensor muscles. The superior one is what crosses in front of your ankle, and the inferior one is more of a Y shape than a solid piece of retinacula. And it begins distal to lateral malleolus on the calcaneus. So you see, if you're looking at the bottom of the calcaneus, it comes up more as a solid piece, and then it breaks into a Y shape. So those are important for stabilization of your extensor tendons. Whereas in the wrist, you have the risk of carpal tunnel with compression of the tunnel with the retinacula above it. That risk is a lot lower in the ankles. You don't typically see that same type of compression with the retinacula, but I did want you to be aware of the location of those 2. And then finally, we're going to cover the foot. So in total, the foot contains 26 bones. It is divided into three sections. So you have your hind foot, your midfoot, and your forefoot. The hind foot consists of the talus and the calcaneus. The talus is the bone that articulates with the tibia and the fibula, and your calcaneus is typically what we refer to as the bone of the heel. So those are in the back. The mid portion of the foot is where your 5 tarsal bones are located. And then the forefoot includes your metatarsals and your phalanges. Similarly to the hand, the first toe has 2 phalanges and all the others have 3. There's also sesamoid bones located in the area of the first metatarsal. So these are going to be located along that plantar surface of the first metatarsal, and they are embedded in the tendon of your flexor hallucis brevis. So we talked at the beginning of the semester about the few sesamoid bones that are located throughout the body, and these are the final 2 that we will touch on. And here is our video for the skeletal of the foot.
All right, last but not least, in terms of the osteology, we're going to talk about the foot. And here we have an articulated foot that includes tarsal bones, metatarsals, and phalanges. And you have a very similar organization as to what you had in the hand and the wrist. But instead of 8 carpal bones, like we had in the wrist, we're going to have 7 tarsal bones. But in comparison, these are considerably larger. And that has a lot to do with the amount of weight that's going to be on these bones at all times. So even when you're sitting, you still have weight there, and of course when you're standing or locomoting. So let's talk about the tarsal bones first, and I'm going to turn to a medial view so you can get a better view of the 2 largest bones. The most superior of your tarsal bones is your talus or your talus bone. This is what's really forming the ankle joint. So you'll have your tibia right here. You would have your medial malleolus of your tibia here and the fibula right here to form that hinge joint that occurs at the ankle, or your talocrural joint. So that's going to be the most superior one here. Then in terms of right below it, you have your calcaneus. This is the largest of your tarsal bones. A lot of times we refer to this bone as the heel bone, because this portion right here is really what you're standing on when you're standing on your heel. Your Achilles tendon or your calcaneal tendon is actually going to attach right about in this region. Okay, so those are 2 of the tarsal bones, and then you're going to have 5 others. You'll have your navicular, which is kind of ship-shaped. That's what it gets its name from. Your cuboid right here. And then you're going to have 3 cuneiforms. You'll have your medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. And sometimes you hear these referred to as first, second, and third cuneiforms. Now I'm going to turn this back to a medial view, and I want you to see that with these bones, they're organized in a way to give what we refer to as arches. So arches are important in terms of the spring that you have in your step, and particularly your talus, calcaneus, and these more posterior tarsal bones, your navicular, as well as your cuboid, are really playing a role in terms of forming those arches. Okay, like we had in the hand, you had metacarpals in the palm region. We're going to have metatarsals in the foot region. And you can see that the first metatarsal is going to be the most robust, or the thick. Second, third, fourth, and fifth metatarsal. And I'm going to turn this to a lateral view now, and you have a styloid process associated with your fifth metatarsal. And you're going to have muscles attaching here, fibularis muscles, that if you have some type of tear in that tendon, it can cause for this region to become avulsed or torn off. So a fairly common injury there. Now, let's think about in terms of the organization of digits. We organize them from first through fifth. If you think about in terms of the hand, your first digit is associated with your thumb. And recall that your thumb is going to be laterally placed. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth. All right? But that's going to be different in the foot. The first digit is associated with your big toe or your great toe, similar to what we're thinking about with the thumb. But think about, is that going to be medial or lateral? Your big toe is going to be medial. So your first digit is going to be medial. Second, third, fourth, and then your fifth is going to be the most lateral. Now you're going to have phalanges, and you're going to have the same amount of phalanges, 14 phalanges. Similar to what you had in the thumb, you're only going to have a proximal and a distal phalange for your first digit, no intermediate, whereas you have a proximal, intermediate, and distal phalanges for digits 2 through 4. Now in comparison, you can see that these, the phalanges are not quite as robust, not as fully developed as what you have in terms of the hand, which is not true for the metatarsals. You can see these are fairly long in comparison to what you had in the metacarpals.
Okay, we are going to go over a few of the muscles of the foot. I know we're getting close to 6 o'clock. If it's okay with everybody, I would like to skip our break because we have 5 slides left. So you're going to be done early, super early tonight. This is probably our shortest lecture. And I wanted to allow time if there were any questions or if we had any complete anatomy issues that we could review those as well. So if that's okay with everybody, let's go ahead and just keep going and get through the muscles of the foot. There are several muscles of the foot. We are not covering all of them in detail. We're going to hit a few of the main muscles and then just be aware that this is not an all-inclusive list. So I'm going to start with, I tried to group some of these together. So this is the extensor digitorum brevis and the flexor digitorum brevis. So the top picture is the extensor, the bottom picture is the flexor. Extensor digitorum brevis originates on the dorsal surface of the calcaneus, and it's going to insert on your toes number 2 through 5. It'll insert via the extensor digitorum longus tendons. And as the name suggests, its action is extension of those toes. And then the flexor digitorum brevis, it's going to originate on the medial calcaneus and the plantar aponeurosis. It will insert on the middle phalanges of toes 2 through 5, and it is responsible for flexion of the middle phalanges of those toes. So digits 2 through 5, these are your 2 big muscles that are responsible for extension and flexion of those toes. And then you have your abductor hallucis and your abductor digiti minimi. So the abductor hallucis is going to originate on the medial process of the calcaneus, and it will insert on the proximal phalanx of the first toe and that medial sesamoid bone. Its responsibility, the name really helps with it, it is abduction of the first toe, but it also has some assistance with flexion of the first toe. But abductor hallucis, abduction of the toe. And then you have your abductor digiti minimi, which is going to go to your 5th digit, so that little toe. It will originate on the lateral process of the calcaneus and insert on the proximal phalanx of that fifth toe. And it is responsible for flexion and abduction of the fifth toe. So this one is a little different because it has a primary responsibility of flexion in addition to the action of abduction. So this is one where the name can be a little bit confusing because it has more than one action. Those are the primary muscles that I want you to know about for the foot. So you have flexion and extension, and then you have your abduction. This picture, which I borrowed from KenHub, if you can't tell, I apologize. I could not get Complete Anatomy to give me a decent picture so you could see the rest of the muscles. But there are many additional muscles in the foot. All of these additional muscles help with those actions that we've talked about. So they help with flexion, they help with extension, adduction, abduction of the toes. And there are several of them, but I didn't think we really needed to know all of those in detail. Learn the main ones with their main function and just know that additional ones are there as well. And we will finish this up with a video that goes through the muscles of the foot.
The most inferior of the muscle groups we're going to discuss are in the foot, and there are actually many muscles associated with the foot. There's actually going to be 20 muscles there, and almost all of them are going to be on the plantar or the sole portion of the foot. Now, I am going to discuss specific actions that can occur, but really they don't have as much importance as, say, you have in terms of the hand. If you think about manipulating things and flexing and extending the digits associated with your hand as opposed to your foot, you can understand that that's not quite as important. It's more important in terms of really being able to keep the foot, the joints associated with the foot safe. And not only are the muscles going to play a role in terms of that, you're going to have specific connective tissues or aponeuroses playing a role. So the plantar aponeurosis, sometimes you hear this referred to as plantar fascia. This is going to play a really important role in terms of keeping those arches of the foot safe as well as the specific joints. So you can see that right in this region. So basically, you can barely see any muscles until you reflect or move the plantar aponeurosis. So if you have any type of damage to this specific area, we often refer to this as plantar fasciitis, and this is a fairly common complaint in the foot region. Now, in this particular picture, you see that the plantar aponeurosis has been removed, and you're going to have the most superficial muscles on the plantar surface. You're going to have the abductor hallucis muscle, which you can see here. Anytime you have hallucis, you know you're talking first digit. So you can see abductor hallucis. Abduct means you're moving away from the midline, so think about moving that first digit even further, more medially. So kind of more medial, because remember the first digit is going to be medial. Your flexor digitorum brevis muscle, which you can see right here. And you can see the tendons are extending to the digits, so allowing for flexion or curling in of the toes. And on the lateral side, you have the abductor digiti minimi, so moving that fifth digit away from the midline, which you can see right here. Now, as you move deeper, so in this particular image, those muscles we just discussed have been removed. We're getting into the lumbricals. And if you recall in previous discussions, we had lumbricals associated with the hand as well. And these are doing the exact same thing. You have the flexion of proximal phalanges and the extension of the middle and distal phalanges. And there's a mistake right here. This should say 2 through 5, so digits 2 through 5, not including the first digit. And similar to what we had in terms of the hand, these muscles actually have a proximal attachment on tendons, so specifically the flexor digitorum longus tendons. So these worm-like muscles are going from the flexor digitoris longus tendons to the actual digit regions. And then lastly, as you move deep, so the deepest layer in terms of the plantar surface muscles, you have interossei. So similar to what we had in the hand as well. And you're going to have those plantar interossei allowing for adduction or moving back, and the dorsal interossei, which you can see in this picture here, allowing for abduction. Now it's important to note, so recall we have those 5 digits associated with the foot. The first digit is going to be your great toe or your big toe. This is going to be the 5th digit. Now in terms of the plane by which these muscles abduct or adduct, it's actually going to be this 2nd digit here. So when you have abduction, they're moving away from the 2nd digit. When you have adduction or adduction, they're moving back towards the 2nd digit. So slightly different than what you have in terms of the hand, which is going to be your 3rd digit. So that completes our discussion of the skeletal muscles of the body. We will return to some of these as we go into further portions of the.
Okay, those are all of my slides, and those are all of the muscles and everything skeletal that you need to know for this class. I did want to briefly go over a couple of things. Your quiz for this week will still open tonight at 8 o'clock. I am going to extend the deadline for that until Saturday. Since we had to switch around when the lecture was occurring, I don't really think it's fair to expect you to study and be able to provide all that information tonight. So I'm going to give you a little extra time. It's going to be due on Saturday instead of Friday. Next week will be your 3rd exam. So on Monday, we will do the occupation-based exploration, thinking about OT's role in the lower extremity. We will also have some time for exam review. If you have things that you would like to review for the exam, please send me an email and I will make sure we cover those. And then the week after that, the week of November 16th and 18th, which is your last week of classes for the semester, we do not have lecture prepared for that week. That was built in as a time for final exam review or overflow if we had materials that we were not able to cover in as much detail as I would have liked. But we were able to get through all of the information that I feel is important for you as future OTs to know. So that week is going to be a review time. So our Monday class that week on the 16th, we will spend that reviewing for the final exam. Think back through the course and things that you would like for me to review that night as well. Send them to me in an email and I will make sure we have all of that for review. And then the Wednesday night of that lab, it will be a general complete anatomy review, looking back over materials that you've learned this semester. So I hope that kind of clarifies what the rest of the semester looks like for us. Are there any questions at this point in time? Any concerns? Any issues with complete anatomy this week?
I have a question about our final exam.
Sure.
Is it on I believe, if I did this correctly, it's on that Wednesday, the 25th, right? Is it going to open at 5, or what time is that exam going to open on the 25th?
Good question. So this was not a date that I was able to set. I know that is right before Thanksgiving, which is not the best time to have it. I am open to having that exam earlier in the day. What else does your day look like? Do you have anything else that you have to do that day? Okay. So if it's okay with everybody, what if we open it at like 8 a.m. and have it open 8 to 12, and that way you can get it done and then you can spend time with family or whatever you're going to be doing for the holiday. Okay?
Are you still going to close it at the normal time or you'll close it at noon?
Um, let's plan for it to be 8 to 12 and close it at noon, um, as opposed to opening it at 5. Um, it will be cumulative. It will be questions that are very similar to you, things that you have seen before throughout the semester. The only addition will be there will be some OT clinical application questions. So when we are reviewing for that exam, um, we will do some review of the OT clinical application type of questions that may be asked. Um, but otherwise, if you have learned the material throughout the semester, and you all have done well on your other exams and quizzes, I am not anticipating this to be a really challenging exam for you. Any other questions or anything else I can do for you tonight?
So do we have to start at 8, or could it be just like a little bit after that? It's not all together,
Say
right?
it
It's
again, I
usually
didn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it you start at 8 a.m. or could you start at like 9 a.m.?
You can
As long as
start
it's
it whenever. I don't know exactly how many questions will be on it. I know it will not need anywhere near that whole time, but I figure 8 to 12 is a pretty good range for you to be able to get it done. So as soon as I finish putting it together, I'll go ahead and let you know kind of how many questions to be expecting and how much time to set aside for it so that you can plan accordingly. All right. If there is nothing else, I know that this is not the same class as fieldwork, but if you are in my fieldwork section and you did your group presentation, would you hang on the line for me just a second? And everybody else, I'll see you next week.
All of us, or just those that did the presentation today?
Just the ones who presented today. I didn't get to debrief with you earlier, so I wanted to just touch base and see how it went. All right. Have I got everybody? Okay, so how did it go? I was the silent fly on the wall, but I was also in clinic starting at 2 o'clock, so I was getting to see bits and pieces. So I just wanted to kind of get your feedback, see what you felt went well, what you thought could have gone better, things you liked, things you would change. Just a debriefing time.
I think overall it went really well. I think one thing we did great as a group is we kept the ladies engaged. I don't know how they are normally, but
Y'all
they,
had a tough group.
yeah, they seem pretty lively. But I think we did a good job keeping them engaged. I think they really enjoyed the Jeopardy game.
Mhm.
I think food was a fun topic for them. You know, they seemed really interested about the general topic. I think we had a good amount of laughter, which I think is important. You know, I think one aspect that was a little difficult was there was some speaking over one another with the